In 1498, a Portuguese explorer sailed into the port of Calicut, India. He had spent nearly a year at sea, losing a third of his crew to scurvy and storms. When local rulers asked why he came so far, his answer was simple: pepper, cinnamon, cloves. These three dried plants were his sole focus, ingredients now easily found for a few dollars. Da Gama risked everything, crossing 17,000 miles of ocean and watching many men die. By 1502, he returned to the same coast, but this time with 20 warships and cannons. He caused a devastating event involving a merchant vessel in Calicut harbor, leading to a tragic loss of many lives. His reason for such harsh actions remained the same: spices. How did these dried plants become so valuable, justifying mass murder and funding empires? The answer begins thousands of years before Da Gama, in ancient Egypt. Around 1500 BCE, Egyptian priests used cinnamon to embalm the dead. They carefully applied these aromatics, believing they preserved the prepared form for the afterlife. Cinnamon was sacred, featured in religious texts, and burned as offerings to gods. But cinnamon doesn't grow near Egypt. It's from Sri Lanka and southern India, thousands of miles away. This means someone was transporting cinnamon across brutal deserts and open water in 1500 BCE. And whoever was doing it was making a fortune. This spice trade network is one of the oldest in human history, predating the Silk Road by centuries. Merchants carried cinnamon, pepper, cardamom, and cloves from southern India and Indonesia. They moved goods by boat, camel caravan, and foot through dangerous terrains. At every stop, the price of spices went up dramatically. By the time black pepper reached a Roman dinner table, its weight in gold was a reasonable comparison. Pepper was literally used as currency in parts of the Roman Empire, accepted as rent and soldiers' pay. Pliny the Elder complained bitterly about Rome's obsession with pepper in his Natural History. He couldn't understand why Romans paid so much for a commodity with no practical value beyond taste. Pliny estimated Rome shipped 50 million sesterces annually to India just for pepper, draining its silver reserves. The trade deficit between Rome and India was massive and never balanced.
Roman coins from the 1st and 2nd centuries found in digs across southern India and Sri Lanka.
When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, they demanded 3,000 pounds of black pepper as ransom.
Not gold, not silver, but pepper. The barbarian king understood its fundamental value. Pepper was portable wealth, lighter than metal, non-perishable, and tradable anywhere for top value. This shows how deeply embedded spices were in the ancient economy.
Those who controlled the supply understood their power. For over 1,000 years, Arab merchants ran the spice trade with an iron grip.
They were the middlemen between South and Southeast Asia and the hungry markets of Europe. They brilliantly protected their monopoly, inventing fake origin stories for spices. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded one such story around 450 BCE. Arab merchants claimed cinnamon sticks were gathered from giant bird nests on steep cliffs. They said traders would leave meat at the base. Birds would carry it up, collapsing the nests. This story was completely made up, every word of it. But Europeans believed these stories for centuries, having no way to verify them. Nobody in the Mediterranean had ever been to a cinnamon forest in Sri Lanka. Arab traders guarded their navigational knowledge of the Indian Ocean as a secret. They understood monsoon wind patterns, enabling seasonal trade voyages. From April to September, southwest monsoons blew ships from Africa to India. From November to February, northeast monsoons reversed, pushing ships back west. This knowledge was key to the entire ocean trading system.
Sharing it with European competitors would have been economic suicide, so they kept it secret.
For centuries, European sailors stared out at the Indian Ocean from East Africa, with no idea how to cross. Alexandria in Egypt became the most important spice trading hub in the ancient world. Merchant ships from India arrived at Red Sea ports, and camel caravans carried cargo to Alexandria. There, it entered the Mediterranean trade network. Roman merchants bought spices at Alexandria's docks and shipped them across the empire. The markup at each stage was enormous, making the merchants fabulously wealthy. This system worked beautifully for those running it, but terribly for European buyers. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the spice trade did not, it simply shifted. Byzantine Constantinople became the new gateway between East and West. Spices continued flowing through it for the next 1,000 years. By the medieval period, European demand for spices reached almost irrational levels. Medieval Europeans wanted spices not just for cooking, but for medicine, religious ceremonies, and perfume. They were also status symbols, announcing wealth to visitors.
A wealthy medieval household used pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and mace in almost everything.
Spiced wine, spiced meat, spiced sauces poured over already spiced dishes. The quantities were massive.
Doctors in medieval Europe prescribed spices for virtually every ailment.
When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, they demanded 3,000 pounds of black pepper as ransom.
Most of these remedies had no medical basis.
But the placebo effect, combined with exotic mystique, made spice-based medicines popular. Apothecary shops were some of the most profitable businesses, their shelves lined with spices. Apothecary shops in cities like London, Florence, and Paris were very profitable. Their shelves were lined with the same products found in aristocratic kitchens. Pepper alone was prescribed for over 100 different conditions. The line between food and medicine barely existed when it came to spices. This obsession made two Italian city-states extraordinarily rich. Venice and Genoa fought for control of the European spice trade for centuries, and Venice mostly won.
Venetian merchants negotiated exclusive deals with Arab suppliers in Alexandria and the Levant. They used their position to charge the rest of Europe whatever they wanted.
By the 1400s, Venice was one of the wealthiest cities on earth, with spices as its foundation.
The grand palaces, St. Mark's Basilica, and merchant galleys were all paid for with pepper money. Venetian spice trade generated more revenue than entire kingdoms. Venice guarded its monopoly ruthlessly. They bribed officials, sabotaged competitors, and used their navy to enforce agreements.
But the same thing that built Venice also planted the seed of its decline. This decision seemed small at the time, but it wasn't.
In 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople after a brutal siege.
Suddenly, the overland trade route to Asia was under Ottoman control.
The Ottomans didn't shut down the spice trade entirely. They taxed it heavily. They rerouted it through their territories, cutting into Venetian profits. This made spices even more expensive for European consumers. The price of pepper in European markets climbed sharply. Cinnamon doubled. Cloves became so expensive that only royalty could afford them regularly. European kings and merchants watched their spice costs skyrocket. They started asking a very dangerous question. What if we got the spices ourselves? Portugal was the first European kingdom to take that question seriously. It was a small country on the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, far from Mediterranean spice routes. Shut out of the Venetian trading network, Portugal had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Starting in the early 1400s, a royal figure funded expeditions down Africa's west coast. Henry never sailed himself, but he financed and organized these voyages. His captains were pushed further south with each trip. The goal was always the same: find a sea route around Africa to India and the spice regions directly, cutting out every middleman between Lisbon and the Malabar coast pepper plantations. It took decades. Portuguese sailors inched their way down the African coastline, mapping harbors, fighting currents, and dying of tropical diseases they had never encountered. In 1488, Captain Bartolomeu Dias finally rounded the southern tip of Africa at the Cape of Good Hope. He proved it was possible to reach the Indian Ocean by sea.
10 years after Dias, Vasco da Gama completed the journey.
He sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Indian Ocean with an Arab navigator he'd compelled to assist, and arrived in Calicut in 1498. The sea route to the spice trade was open. Spain and Portugal nearly went to war over who had the right to trade in which parts of the world. The Pope himself had to intervene. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 drew an imaginary line down the middle of the Atlantic, giving Portugal everything to the east and Spain everything to the west. The two largest Catholic empires on earth
literally split the planet in half. The driving force behind that negotiation was spices. Da Gama's first voyage was mostly a trade mission, and it went poorly. The goods he brought from Portugal were laughably inadequate for the sophisticated Indian market. He offered cheap cloth and trinkets to merchants dealing in silk, gold, and gemstones.
The ruler of the city was not impressed.
But Da Gama did manage to return to Lisbon with a small cargo of pepper and cinnamon.
Even that modest haul earned a profit of 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. 60 times!
The math was irresistible.
Portugal immediately began sending larger, better-armed fleets to the Indian Ocean. This is where the spice trade turned violent in a way it had never been before. Under commanders like Afonso de Albuquerque, Portuguese warships attacked Arab and Indian merchant vessels. They bombarded coastal cities and seized strategic ports by force. They captured Goa on India's west coast in 1510. They took Malacca on the Malay Peninsula in 1511. Choking off the narrow strait that every ship between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass. They reached the Moluccas, the legendary spice islands in present-day Indonesia, where cloves and nutmeg actually grew by 1512. In just over a decade, Portugal built fortified trading posts from East Africa to Southeast Asia, all connected by naval firepower, designed to control the global spice supply. The Portuguese approach was simple and uncompromising. They demanded every merchant ship carry a Portuguese trading pass, a cartaz.
Ships caught without one were seized or sunk.
Entire port cities that refused to cooperate were bombarded with cannon fire.
Da Gama's second voyage in 1502 set the tone.
He intercepted the Miri, a trading vessel carrying devout individuals and merchants returning from Mecca. He looted the ship, locked the passengers below deck, and burned it. Hundreds of people died. This was not a battle. It was a statement. The Indian Ocean spice trade now belonged to Portugal. But Portugal was a small country with a tiny population, trying to control a vast ocean. An ocean stretching from Mozambique to the Philippines.
The empire was spread impossibly thin, and corruption among officials was rampant.
Governors and captains skimmed profits, ran side businesses, and let trading posts decay. By the late 1500s, Portugal struggled to hold its spice empire together. And a new player had entered the game, the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic emerged as a major trading power in the late 16th century. They approached the spice trade with an organizational ruthlessness that made the Portuguese look casual. Portugal was the first European kingdom to take that question seriously.
This was not just a trading company. It was the world's first publicly traded corporation. With the power to raise armies, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, and wage war. At its peak, the VOC employed over 50,000 people and operated a private navy of 40 warships, making it larger than most European national militaries. Investors across the Netherlands bought shares in the company. From wealthy Amsterdam merchants down to servants and small shopkeepers. They pooled their savings to buy fractional stakes. The VOC was a privatized empire with shareholders, and its primary target was the spice trade in Southeast Asia. The VOC went straight for the source. While Portugal built coastal trading posts, the Dutch wanted to control the islands where spices grew. Nutmeg and mace came from an extremely limited area, the Banda Islands in eastern Indonesia.
A tiny volcanic archipelago.
These 10 small islands, scattered across the Banda Sea like green stones,
were the only place on Earth where nutmeg trees grew naturally.
Whoever controlled the Banda Islands controlled the world's entire nutmeg supply.
The VOC decided they would be the ones.
In 1621, a colonial leader launched a forceful action on the Banda Islands.
The indigenous Bandanese population had traded nutmeg for centuries and had no interest in an exclusive monopoly.
Cohen's solution was genocide.
Dutch soldiers and Japanese mercenaries caused immense suffering, leading to the displacement and forced labor of virtually the entire Bandanese population.
Estimates range from 14,000 people, reduced to roughly 1,000.
The VOC then repopulated the islands with individuals compelled into labor and their supervisors.
They ran nutmeg plantations on behalf of the company.
The islands became private corporate property, farmed by enslaved people, guarded by Dutch soldiers. All so that shareholders in Amsterdam could profit from nutmeg sales in European markets. The VOC systematically took control of the clove trade as well, forcing clove production onto specific islands and destroying clove trees on any island they didn't control. Controlling vast portions of the Indian subcontinent, commanding its own private army of over 250,000 soldiers. They literally set fire to spices to maintain artificial scarcity. The smoke carried the sweet smell of cloves across the harbors of the Banda Islands.
The indigenous Bandanese population had traded nutmeg for centuries and had no interest in an exclusive monopoly,
because it meant their entire business model depended on nobody else ever growing these plants anywhere else. The Dutch dominance of the spice trade in Southeast Asia was so complete that they even traded territory to protect it. In 1667, the Dutch and English signed the Treaty of Breda to end the Second Anglo-Dutch War. As part of that deal, the Dutch gave up their claim to Manhattan.
In exchange, they kept control of Run Island in the Banda Archipelago.
A tiny speck of volcanic rock covered in nutmeg trees. At the time, the deal made perfect sense. Nutmeg was worth more per ounce than gold.
And Manhattan was a barely developed colonial outpost with a few hundred settlers. In exchange, they kept control of Run Island in the Banda archipelago. Meanwhile, the British East India Company, chartered in 1600, was building its own spice trading empire.
Though it took a different path than the Dutch.
Largely shut out of the nutmeg and clove trade in the Moluccas after violent confrontations with the VOC, including the Amboina massacre of 1623, where Dutch authorities tortured and executed 10 English traders,
forcing clove production onto specific islands and destroying clove trees on any island they didn't control.
The British East India Company eventually grew into one of the largest commercial enterprises on the planet, controlling vast portions of the Indian subcontinent, commanding its own private army of over 250,000 soldiers, and generating revenue exceeding the entire national budget of the British government. But its origins were rooted in the same basic drive as every other European spice venture: get spices, sell them, get rich.
The great irony is that the empires built to control it also planted the seeds of its destruction.
European colonizers didn't just extract spices. They studied the plants, collected seeds and cuttings, cataloged growing conditions, and eventually transplanted them to new locations around the world. The French smuggled clove seedlings out of Dutch territory in an act of botanical espionage, and planted them in their own colonies in the Indian Ocean, particularly on Mauritius, Réunion, and Zanzibar.
The British transplanted nutmeg trees to Grenada in the Caribbean, Penang in Malaya, and Singapore.
Pepper cultivation spread from India to Southeast Asia, Africa, and eventually Brazil.
Within a few generations, the geographic monopolies that had made spices so valuable were broken.
When nutmeg grows in the Caribbean and cloves grow in Zanzibar, controlling the Banda Islands doesn't matter anymore.
If the VOC had simply traded spices rather than building an empire of controlled plantations and artificial scarcity,
this would be a very different story.
But the tighter they gripped their monopoly, the more incentives other nations had to break it.
By the 19th century, the spice trade had fundamentally changed.
Advances in agriculture meant spices could be grown commercially in dozens of tropical regions. Refrigeration technology in the late 1800s reduced the need for spices as food preservatives,
removing one of the oldest economic drivers for the trade.
Faster shipping routes through the Suez Canal opened in 1869.
Collapsed the distances that had once made spice transport so expensive and dangerous.
Steam-powered cargo ships replaced wooden sailing vessels. A journey that had killed a third of da Gama's crew in 1498 could now be completed in weeks with minimal risk. Pepper was no longer worth its weight in gold. Nutmeg was no longer worth a war. Cinnamon was no longer worth killing for. The commodities that had driven 5 centuries of exploration, conquest, and empire building became ordinary grocery items, sold by weight in corner shops and market stalls.
The scarcity that had made these plants so valuable was gone.
But the legacy of the spice trade is carved into the world in ways you can still trace today.
The shipping lanes that modern cargo vessels follow across the Indian Ocean were first mapped by Arab dhows.
Carrying cinnamon and pepper.
The colonial borders of Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia were drawn by European powers.
Chasing spice profits. The multicultural populations of port cities, from Goa to Malacca to Cape Town, exist because the spice trade brought people from different continents into contact for centuries. Legend. The cuisine of nearly every culture on Earth was shaped by spice trading patterns. Why does Indian food use so many spices? Because India was the source.
Why does Indonesian food blend Chinese, Arab, and Dutch influences?
Because all three groups came to Indonesia for cloves and nutmeg, bringing their cooking traditions. Why do Caribbean dishes feature nutmeg so prominently? Because the British transplanted nutmeg trees to Grenada.
And the financial systems that govern the modern global economy trace their roots directly back to the spice trade. The concept of the joint stock company, where thousands of individual investors pool money to fund large commercial ventures, was pioneered by the VOC to finance spice expeditions.
The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the first modern stock exchange in the world, was created in 1602, specifically to trade shares of the VOC.
Modern corporate structures, shareholder capitalism, the idea of limited liability. All of these concepts were developed to support spice trading operations. The financial architecture of the 21st century economy was built on dried flower buds and tree bark.
The spice trade also left a darker inheritance.
The plantation systems that Europeans built in the Spice Islands, relying on enslaved labor, land seizure, and monoculture agriculture,
became the template for colonial economies around the world. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the cotton plantations of the American South, the rubber plantations of the Belgian Congo, all followed patterns first established in the nutmeg groves of the Banda Islands and pepper fields of the Malabar coast.
The human cost of the spice trade did not end when spices became cheap.
It echoed through centuries of colonial exploitation.
And communities in Indonesia, India, and Sri Lanka are still living with the economic and social consequences of that era.
There is something almost absurd about the whole story when you step back and look at it.
Millions of people displaced, forced into servitude, and lost their lives. Entire civilizations disrupted. The borders of continents redrawn. All because medieval Europeans really wanted their food to taste better.
But that framing misses the deeper point. Spices were never just about flavor. They were about power.
Whoever controlled the supply of pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves controlled immense wealth, armies, navies, governments, and the destinies of millions.